but it cut off, so I'm back now. So I was saying last week that I don't necessarily agree with the idea of the Africans being docile, right? We mentioned that last week, and I kind of went through the lecture, and towards the end of the lecture, I talked about how when enslaved Africans would free themselves, they would set up these free communities called Maroon Communities, right? So this is what Gomez is talking about, right? So we have this group of Africans called the Akan who are establishing enslaved rebellions. But then you have this group, the Maroons, who are stifling their rebellion, okay? And this is the contradiction. So the people who freed themselves by doing the very same thing that the Akans are doing, right? Try to put these Akans back into enslavement, right? So there's a contradiction at play. Like, how are you gonna be mad at me for trying to free yourself? How are you gonna be mad at me for trying to free yourself when you did the very same thing, right? And when I first heard about this, I had to do some research. So I'm like, well, why would they do that, you know? And really what I found, and I can't say this is the complete answer, I'm sure there's a lot more research out there, but one of the threads of thought that I found was that because of their ability to free themselves and establish freedom for some time, right? They didn't want these newly freed Africans try to come and mess up what they've already established, right? So if they come looking for y'all, what's stopping them coming to grab me, right? Because there's no real distinction that says, yes, I'm free. One of the things about Maroons is they will establish their communities like way up in the hills. So for example, in Jamaica, the Maroon societies in Jamaica will be like way up in the mountaintops, right? So they're very remote. So it's a great place to hide out and stay away from those looking for you, right? So they didn't want the activities of those newly freed Africans to kind of mess up what they had going on. So that's one of the reasons why they participated in the re-enslavement of those who tried to free themselves. I'm not justifying it, I'm not agreeing with it, but based off of the research that I found, that's the, I guess, justification that was provided. But it's a very good question, and it shows me you're doing like a really attentive reading of what you're engaging. You said there was another question that you had?
One last one about there was the mention of the colleges started by the Freedmen's Bureau. Are those HBCUs or HBC?
No,
I'm not sure what the acronym is.
Yeah, HBCUs, you're absolutely correct. The Fisk, Clark Atlanta, those are. But I'm going to get to that a little bit more in detail when I go through my notes, because just like last week, I didn't agree with the docility. I have a problematization with the claim of the Freedmen's Bureau being so instrumental in establishing institutions of education for African people. But great questions. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, or thoughts about the reading before I get to my notes? Okay. So for me, one, how the chapter, actually the book is entitled Reversing Cell. The author, Michael A. Gomez, is a great historical text to kind of understand the African genealogical experience, right? To me, I found the reading to be very accessible. It's not like Glissant, where it's kind of like you have to contemplate and derive meaning. He's very straightforward in his delivery and in his message. But the way that the chapter starts off on page 171 stood out to me, right? The most arresting, startling, disturbing, and indisputable fact concerning the whole of the Americas and their respective process of emancipation was that whether slaveholders were compensated for their loss or not, the enslaved themselves received virtually nothing. So what that is saying, right, we've come to the point that we viewed this institution of slavery being something that is not good. We're going to deem it illegal, right? And what we're going to do to create amends is we're going to provide payments for those who were running this illegal institution, okay? We're going to provide a stipend. We're going to provide a stimulus check for those who were holding the slaves, the slave owners, right? This is what the logic is. And what they're saying is, what Gomez is saying is, the enslaved themselves, right, the victims of this atrocious system, receive nothing. Okay, so this is how he opens up the essay. And it's like, just the audacity to, that's like, okay, we're gonna say,
hello, professor. Is everything okay? You're muted.
if this happens again, we'll end class, right? I'm not, because this is like hella unprofessional. I'm not gonna do that to you. And then I'm gonna ask you guys to look at the recording for Tuesday's Group A's lecture, right, at your convenience. And then we'll just have to, because I mean, I don't know what's going on, and I don't know why this keeps happening, but I don't want to keep stalling y'all out and fucking up y'all day. So if it cuts out again, I'm just gonna end the lecture today. I'll refer you guys to look at the lecture that was posted on Google Classroom for Group A, okay? I apologize, I have everybody off, so I really don't know what's going on. Okay, so the payment to the enslavers, right? The payments to those who are running this enslavement institution. This would be the equivalent to the government saying, okay, the transportation of drugs is illegal. But for all of you who are doing this drug dealing, because your economic institution stops, we're going to give you guys some money to kind of sustain yourselves, right? This will be the exact same logic, okay? So this is one of the things that jumped out at me. And then, so on page, also on 171, he talks about a 4-year transition period after the emancipation, right? So where, okay, now you're freed, right? You're no longer enslaved, but from the date that you're so-called free, 4 years after that, you have not left the very same plantation that you were freed from, right? So really, how free are you, right? Your material condition has not changed. You're still in the very same location, okay? Also on page 172, he talks about the worker strikes that took place in Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad, right? And these working strikes consisted anywhere from 1838 to 1843. Now, to me, this is profound because when I think about worker strikes, I don't even think about enslaved Africans being organizers of worker strikes, right? But if you look at this, and if you look at these dates, these precede a lot of the conventional workers' rights organizing that you've seen done, right, in our contemporary moment. This is the 1800s, right? So I found that to be pretty profound as well. Also, this notion on 173 that education created a class division, a class stratification, right? So Africans in the Caribbean who were able to obtain some type of education, they were able to distance themselves or separate themselves from the Africans who were not able to obtain this education, right? Now, this is particular to the Caribbean, because I want to draw this distinction because of the point that Joanne made earlier, okay? So the distinction that is able to be made of social access and social uplift when you're able to attain education in the Caribbean, okay? And I'm gonna read this on page 173, the first full paragraph, starting with the backlash, okay? The backlash from former slaveholders resulted in a period of renewed oppression. Contiguous with enslavement, the African descendants responded in ways similar to their resistance during slavery, right? So the backlash that resulted from them being freed, right, caused those who ran the enslavement institution to set up institutions that further oppressed the freely enslaved Africans, right? So the way that these freely enslaved Africans responded was to organize and resist in ways that they did once they were enslaved, right? Because at the end of the day, if our conditions have not changed, why should we stop doing the things that are going to help us improve our situation, right? So we're going to organize, we're going to rebel, we're going to revolt just as vehemently as we did once we were in the institution of enslavement, right? So the African descendants responded in ways similar to their resistance during slavery. Cultural opposition took the form of reinvigorated embrace of African-influenced religion, while the folklores, memorials, and the languages itself evinced a deep-seated anger. The cultural worked in tandem with the political, and violent revolts against reconfigured oppression broke out all over the Caribbean. So the way that they responded, right, was cultural as well as political. So they went back to their old African languages. They went back to their old African religions, right? And they still engaged in these violent uprisings, okay? These included the 1844 Guerreri in Gray in Dominica, the Angel Gabriel riots of British Guyana in 1856, the 1862 Vox Populi riots of St. Vincent, the 1876 Belana, I think, riots of Tobago, and the Confederate riots of Barbados the same year. Perhaps the most representative of these uprisings was the Morant Bay disturbances of 1865 in Jamaica, led by the lay preacher Paul Bogle. So not only does this detail, right, this idea that Africans being docile is inaccurate, right, because this is a host of rebellions that took place throughout the Caribbean. These are, in some regard, rebellions that were led by preachers. Gabriel Prosser was a preacher. Paul Bogle was a preacher, right? When you get to United States soil, Nat Turner is another one of these preachers who took up the notion of rebellion. This idea of what they call liberation theology, right? So preaching and using the Bible not to enslave, but to help liberate, okay? Okay. And then so, I don't know if you noticed, but there's a shift that takes place on 174 after Freedom's Teas, right? So he goes from talking about the Caribbean to talking about, sorry, that was my son. He goes from talking about the Caribbean to talking about the United States, right? So it's the shift that takes place. And he says that Black codes was a way of limiting the movement of newly freed Africans in the United States, right? Not only did it restrict their movement, it restricted their opportunity, and it restricted their ability to be human. Has anybody heard of a laughing barrel? The laughing barrel is a byproduct of the Black codes. So let's just say you out and you're walking. Now this comes into play particularly when white folks are present, right? You out with your homeboy, you walking, your homeboy crack a joke, your homegirl crack a joke, right? The natural thing to do is to laugh, right? But if white folks are present, what you have to do is find a laughing barrel, suppress your laughter, stick your head inside the laughing barrel, laugh, compose yourself, and then go on about your business, right? So this is a component of the Black codes called the laughing barrel, again, that is meant to restrict human behavior, right? Because to laugh is the essence of humanity, right? That's a human emotion, that's a human response. But think about the psychology behind having to force yourself to suppress a laugh, right? Find a barrel to put your head in, laugh, compose yourself, and then go on about your business, right? Just so someone else doesn't see you engage in human activity, right? So these are the way that these Black codes played out. So again, this contradiction in this notion of, yes, we're free, right? But we're gonna find other ways to constrict and restrict your body and constrict and restrict your opportunities, right? So we get to Joanne's point about the Freedmen's Bureau, and I'll read the paragraph. It's on 175 towards the top of the page. I'm going to start with the sentence that starts with, perhaps more importantly. Perhaps more importantly, the Bureau promoted the education of freed persons and created day, evening, Sunday, and vocational schools. The African descendants of all ages sat in the same classrooms, eager to finally read the Bible for themselves. Colleges were also established with Bureau assistants during this time, including the Hampton Institute and Fisk, Howard, and Atlanta universities. Hundreds, if not thousands, of whites from the North volunteered as teachers. And by 1870, there were some over about 2,500 students, right? And about 4,000 schools. So again, I want to problematize this notion. And just to provide resources, right? So this book is The Education of the Black in the South from 1860 to 1935. The author is James D. Anderson. And it's from this book that I'm going to build my problematization, right? My problematic. First of all, yes, the Freedmen's Bureau did come in the South. Yes, their goal was to help newly freed Africans to establish institutions of education. But according to the work of James Anderson, their attempts were by and large unsuccessful because Black folks had already established institutions of schooling, right? There's an account that one of the Freedmen Bureau individuals from Philadelphia, I believe, he writes in his journal, when he gets to, I want to say South Carolina, he sees like these groups of these newly freed Africans just huddled together, like maybe 4 or 5 people in a group, right? And as he got closer, he would see that they'll be holding like a piece of a newspaper, right? Like a piece of a page of a newspaper. And what they were doing was passing those little pieces of the paper around and teaching each other how to read, right? So this claim Gomez makes about the Sabbath schools, right? Those were already in play when the Freedmen's Bureau came to the South, right? They already had went out into like, they had already went out into the forests and what have you, went out to remote areas away from the plantation and would gather on the day that they was given off, right? And establish these means of education. There's another account in the book by James Anderson that talks about what the Freedmen's Bureau tried to do would establish like meetings to rally money, right? And they would also always think, okay, well, we're going to go into this community. They may be able to, put together about $25 at the most. We'll bring extra money to help build them a school, right? And with this one account, they said this group of people, right, fresh out of enslavement, right? Like fresh out of enslavement, not even 50 years after being enslaved, were able to raise $1,400. I think $800 of that was raised in cash. The rest was applied by materials that were being able to be supplied to build the school, right? So this notion that the Freedmen's Bureau came in, as a savior and provided and initiated education for Blacks who were newly and free is not really the case, right? They've already had this institution going. In fact, according to James Anderson, the whole idea of a public school system derived from the work and the organizing efforts of newly freed Africans post-enslavement, right? The whole idea of a school system. And what he argues, because by and large, the slaveholders, they didn't need education, right? They had somebody to work for them. But because education was something that's innate in African people and something that was foreclosed in African people, we found ways to educate ourselves, and they began to get higher and more educated than the slaveholders were, right? So they had to come in, the state, right, had to come in and balance, quote unquote, the opportunities to afford everyone education, right? So now the schools that these African people established for themselves begin to get infiltrated by white Southerners, taken over, and then they become like actually schools that with money being poured into them. And the Blacks who built the schools lose the schools, right? And then they circle back and create these Fisk universities, the Howard universities, the HBCUs, right? So just this idea that this the Freedmen's Bureau was this entity that provided education to Blacks in the South is a misnomer, right? They were establishing these institutions during enslavement, because that's the only way that a year or two removed out of enslavement, you could establish schools. You had to be doing it during enslavement. That's just the only thing that makes sense, right? And this is also what James Anderson is arguing. So that's something I want to problematize within the text that we're reading. Okay. Well, 2 more points. Has anybody heard of the term 40 acres and a mule? Or anybody heard of that before the reading?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, was that you, George? Can you kind of speak to what you hear about or what you heard about 40 acres and a mule?
Well, from what I learned in my history classes in high school, there was originally this idea that every formerly enslaved family would be given 40 acres and a mule.
Yep.
And yeah.
Yeah, that was their reparations, right? And I'm not going to belabor that point because you guys understand what that is then. But the chapter details how President Johnson was effectively able to take that back, right? To rescind whoever got the money in the land, they were able to take that back. Sorry, not the money, but the land and the mule, they were able to take that back, and some people never received that, right? So this spawns this notion of reparations that kind of takes effect today, right? If you were paying close attention to specifically the Democratic election, the notion or the idea of reparations was on the table, right? This stems from this idea of 40 acres and a mule. The last thing I'll read on page 176, and I think this is important because it really speaks to what we've just went through and what we're still going through. And I'm starting on the bottom of 176. Well, I'll say towards the middle of 176, the institution. But before I read that, just keep in mind what Gomez is talking about before he gets to that section, right? He's talking about how some African people were able to move their way into political office. Okay, so this becomes important to what I'm going to read now. The institution made reimpositions of white control possible and was simply put state-sponsored terrorism. In reaction to radical Reconstruction, white Southerners unleashed a widespread, unrelenting campaign of sheer horror aimed at driving Blacks, along with their white supporters, out of the political process and back to the plantation. They were immobilized and put in their place. As early as 1866, organizations such as the Regulators, the Black Horse Cavalry emerged, terrorizing Blacks throughout the South. After 1867, the number of these clandestine societies mushroomed to include the Palefaces, and they actually called themselves the Palefaces. That's the name that they chose. But, okay. The Palefaces, the Rifle Club of South Carolina, the White Line of Mississippi, the White League of Louisiana, the White Brotherhood, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Together with the Black Codes, these terrorist organizations were highly effective in intimidating a defenseless population and worked with the white politicians to resist and gradually overturn progressive legislation through murder, mutilation, rapine, and confiscation. So why would I say that this speaks strongly to our recent past, our very, very recent past, and I would even say our current moment? Why would I say that?
I mentioned this in the breakout room, but basically it's like a continuous cycle of Black folks gaining and fighting for their freedom, and then something happens that basically white supremacy reigns supreme and it reoppresses Black people. And until today, there's legal ways that continue to reoppress Black folks. And then here it explicitly says they work with white politicians. I actually highlighted the same area. And like today, what we can relate it to is the prison system and incarceration. So yeah, I get really frustrated at this because yeah.
You're absolutely right, Joanne. Jana, what's that? A cab?
A cab?
Yeah,
All cops are bastards.
Say what?
All cops are bastards.
Okay.
Basically,
I never heard of that.
Wait, you've never heard of? Okay.
Nah,
So,
I swear. I'm still off the FTP, right? Like that's my generation. Like, I'm from the NWA area. That's new to me. But I'm not. I don't disagree.
Don't worry. Basically, like Joanne kind of like took the words like out of my mouth. I wrote down in like my contemporary analysis. I was like, "Oh, 2020, you were the worst year of them all." police brutality, Asian American hate crimes being at an all-time high, and the fact that there are still evil people existing out there, just, it genuinely makes me mad. Because, like, we can move on from, like, the last disaster and make some progress, but we're never going to be out of the woods, you know? It's kind of like a sad sentiment.
Yeah.
Because, like, people like this are always going to exist, and sometimes you can change their minds, but most of the time you just can't.
Yeah.
And most of them are, like, old anyway, so, like, I mean, they'll die, so.
Yeah. But they have kids though, right? And they instruct their kids. But
Yeah.
I think also to add on to what you guys are saying, because you're spot on, right? Obama to Trump. That's what's also played out within the pages of what I just read, right? Because again, think about before what I actually read, you have African people being placed in political office. Fast forward to our early 2000s, right? Obama's in office, right? And then the way that the state responds is they put someone who's ultra conservative in to legally do away with all the legislation that Obama passed that was progressive, right? And then you have the Tea Party, which comes up under Obama's administration, right? That's one like conservative group, right? But then it shifts to something more dramatic under Trump's administration, to where you have the Boogaloo Boys, you have the Proud Boys, you have a litany of these organizations pop up, right? So this ebb and flow of progress and repression, it continues to play out, right? We won't read this, but there's a really, really, really exquisite essay by Frantz Fanon. It's called Racism and Culture. And he talks about every time that culture shifts, racism will shift along with it, right? And it will just morph itself to be able to contort itself to be able to still be applicable and valid in the society in the new way that the society is operating, right? And this is what's at play within the pages of Gomez's work. So I'm gonna put myself on pause. We have about 15 minutes or so left. Let's jump into our fishbowl, and then we'll hopefully be able to get into some class conversation. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer for the fishbowl?
If I can, that would be awesome.
Okay, Joanne.
I also could. Too.
Okay, Kim.
I can volunteer too.
And Kenneth. Okay, we'll do you guys. You three. Anybody else? Did I miss anybody? Okay, I got everybody there. So Joanne, Kim, and Kenneth, I'll shut up and it's on one of you.
I think the thesis for the article that Gomez is trying to alliterate was that although slavery was abolished, the untreatment of slavery still existed because society still never accepted their freedom, and they continued to limit them. Both Africans in the Caribbean and in the US still tried to resist their untreatment, whether it be in the Caribbean, where they had combat against the white, and in the US, where they tried to take public office.
I agree with you. Basically, along with my group, we were able to talk about what was the thesis and what was Gomez was talking about. I also came to the same conclusion as you, Kenneth, about how the enslaved people were able to be free from slavery, but they still weren't free from the shackles of oppression, and they were forced to like walk on eggshells from the law, especially how they were just like, like making sure that, oh, you don't do this, or don't do that, and everything.
I agree with what you guys have said. And I think part of that is also because even though the words or emancipation happened, the 13th and the 14th Amendment were so vague that it made it so difficult to really understand what freedom was and what that looked like. So like you can even tell by the way that Gomez writes, and he will criticize and say so-called freedom, because there was no freedom. There was, like I said earlier, just a cycle of like repression. And I also, we were talking about it in our breakout room, how like why was this repression or the cycle of repression like omitted from like history, US history books now? Like was it so was the redundancy of that cycle so redundant that like US history book writers were just like, oh no, they get the point that it's just, okay, we're just going to do just the one cycle and then call it a day. And then same thing with like the multiple groups of white supremacists. Like why do we mainly only know the KKK when there's like a handful of groups? Like, was it like, oh, okay, we'll just name this one group that we know is legally terrorizing Black people, and we'll just omit the rest. We'll just make ourselves look good and just have the one group. Yeah, like I said, I'm very frustrated about this topic. I'm good.
No, I agree with you fully. Like every time whenever I heard about the news about everything, I'm just like, why? Why can't they already consider them illegal already?
Right.
Like literally, why can't they arrest them? They've been lynching so many people. Like it gets me frustrated because sometimes like a lot of kids that are around my age die, and I'm like, are you seriously not seeing the problem in society? This is happening. Why can't we do something about it?
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, before I get any more frustrated about that, from the reading, I was also able to like see a lot of things that I haven't been able to see, especially in my high school. Even though my high school was supposed to be more progressive and everything, they still can't teach us a lot of things due to the limits of the textbooks and not enough information that they weren't able to give out, which kind of like makes me like feel like I guess I have to do most of the information myself. Like I didn't know about the differences between the black codes and the South slave codes, that they were like really similar to each other. Like I didn't know about that. All I knew basically about anything about the enslaved people and slavery was mostly about like, you know, the laws and amendments, as well as like all the terrorization they've been doing.
Yeah. I want to point out two things in Joanne's comments, right? So when we think about our questions portion of your journals, what Joanne just demonstrated perfectly, right, was a question for critique, right? So why is it that we only learn about just the KKK, right? That's a question that's critiquing how we're being presented information. That's also embedded in what Kim is saying as well, right? Like I only learned a really small aspect of this in high school, right? So these are questions of critique, but they could also serve as questions that produce research. Because if they wanted to, Joanne and Kim could get together and that could be a paper that they produce based off of that question, right? So these are two ways that questions can kind of produce academic research. So I want to bring that to your guys' attention. Also, just to kind of provide you guys some context around this idea of the KKK and how it operates, right? One of the reasons we only know about the KKK is because they're still in existence today, right? It's pretty obvious. But this is where the KKK can become effective for the overall institution of white supremacy, or what I would call white inferiority, right? Because what you could do, say, I'm not racist. The KKK, that's racism, right? And I have the power to move laws, right? I have the power to sign housing contracts, right? I have the power to offer bank loans, et cetera, right? So I have the ability to really impact your daily quotidian life, right? I have the ability to oppress you daily by not allowing you to get this home, right? By not allowing you to come into my bank, or when you come to the bank, I'm gonna follow you like you're a criminal, right? But I could still say, I'm not a racist because I don't wear the hood, I don't wear the robe, right? I'm not lynching you, right? So these are the ways that the symbols, right? And they're obviously more than symbols, but symbols like the KKK can distract us from viewing the prevalence and the prevalence of racism and white supremacy, right? Or what I would call white inferiority. Because you could say, this is it. Yes, this is actually racism. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. But you can't quite put your finger on this other type of racism. And honestly, the one you can't put your finger on is more dangerous, right? The ability to call the police on you because you're running in front of my house and the police can potentially kill you is a lot more dangerous than you coming to my house, burning a cross and trying to pull me out of my house and lynch me, right? That's just so outside of the context of reason the former, the phone call is more likely, right? But the way that we've been viewed to understand racism is the KKK, right? So this is how, although this is why it's still prevalent for those who ascribe to this notion of whiteness, this notion of white inferiority, this notion of white supremacy, right? So there's two ways to kind of look at this racism thing, right? It's the in your face, the one that's tactile, you can see and touch, and then there's one that's a lot more pervasive that you can't quite put your finger on. And to me, that pervasive one is a lot more insidious, right? Like if you don't fuck with Black folks, I would rather you just let me know and I know where you stand, right? But don't come up to me and be all buddy and you feel some kind of way about me in real life, right? Like I could deal with the upfront, you know what I mean? But that's my personal opinion. But I did want to provide those contexts and the ways to look at these things like the KKK. Does that make sense?
Yes. What you said actually reminds me of kind of like a picture that I saw online about like the iceberg, about overt racism, where you can see the top of the iceberg, but then underwater the iceberg is bigger, and it talks about like it shows like a list of like things that are pretty much racist things, but we don't really realize it's racist until we really look into it. And it's even bigger underwater, which is pretty much the iceberg.
Yeah. Have you guys heard of the term hegemony?
Hegemony?
Mm-hmm.
It sounds familiar.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds familiar.
So it's the golden apple. Explain, Kenneth, what you mean, man? The golden apple.
So like there's like a rotten apple, but it's just covered in gold.
Gotcha. Yeah. But hegemony is like how this idea or this notion of white supremacy operates through society, right? So the fact that you only know a certain part of the institution of enslavement through your school system is a byproduct of hegemony, right? So I control the way that information is being disseminated, so I could determine what gets in and what gets out, right? Hegemony will allow you to say that this particular art is deemed acceptable, but graffiti is unacceptable, right? Hegemony will allow you to determine that when people are protesting and damaging property, that's violence. But when the police beat your ass, that's force, right? Hegemony allows you to determine these and make these distinctions, right? It's the system of power that allows these isms like racism, sexism, homophobia to be real, right? It allows it to be unseen but have real consequences for you, right? That's this notion of hegemony. And we'll kind of approach that closer throughout as we get throughout the semester. Is there any other comments or questions before I show you guys next week's reading?
I had one last thing. Sorry.
Sure.
So I just thought I made a relation upon reading like the Freedmen's Bureau. I thought it was interesting how like I know that it like some of the things they did were kind of like there were already like school systems set in place, but I thought how some of the things that they were doing was very relative to the programs that the Black Panther Party were producing. Like I'm pretty sure that's like later, like in the 60s.
Yeah, I don't, and I don't want to take away from the good things that the Freedmen's Bureau does, but often what happens, right? You ossify the work of the people and what they were doing for themselves by giving credit to just these entities like the Freedmen's Bureau. But yeah, and really, what that is, Joanne, is just filling voids that were needed, right? And the Freedmen's Bureau recognized, okay, education is a void, so let's go in and fill that void, right? They also did like medical work and things of that nature for the community. So that's another void that's there. Let's go ahead and fill that void. Black Panther is the exact same thing, right? What really the initial movement, like the initial thing that got the Black Panthers actually started was the fact that there was no stop sign on a particular corner where Huey and Bobby lived at. And there was a continuous accidents that took place, right? And they would petition the city to put up a stop sign, put up a stop light. They never would. So they started doing stop light work themselves, right? And that was the impetus that started the whole Black Panther. So again, this notion of feeling the need, right? Now we know that the police are brutalizing people. So what we're gonna do is patrol the police. So that way, when someone's pulled over, we can make sure that there's no brutality that takes place. We're feeling a need, right? Children are hungry before school. So we're gonna provide a free breakfast program, right? Which in turn is the free lunch program that we all get the chance to experience in K through 12 education today, right? So you're absolutely right, Joanne. And really a lot of the work that marginalized communities do are to fill the voids that are left by the state, right? To put it crudely and to be honest, right? Gangbanging, that's filling a void that's left by the state. Drug dealing, that's filling a void that's left by the state, by resources that the state put in your community. Does that make sense what I'm saying to y'all? Okay. So these are just things that people who don't have what they need are forced to do to survive, right? But that's a very good point. Any other questions? All right, let me pull up what we'll be reading next week. Give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. So next week, we'll be reading W.E.B. Du Bois, Souls of Black Folks. This kind of picks up around the same time of this Reconstruction era, okay? There's not a lot of pages, but it's dense. And also this book was published in 1900. So it's written like it was published in 1900. So you got to kind of struggle with the literature. Give yourself some time, and don't feel like you have to know everything. That's what I'll fill in those gaps for you. But just, make your way through the text. Try to think about how this relates to what you just read, because they do tie. They're chronological in the time span that they're covering. Anything else? Nope. I don't have anything for you guys other than that. You guys have a good weekend. Try to stay safe, try to stay healthy, get some sun, drink some water, get some exercise. See you next week. Peace.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye, Professor.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.